There are memories that do not begin with time, but with scent. Mine began with myrrh and silence. The halls of the palace were always cool. Even in the burning months, when the sun turned sand into fire, the stone beneath my bare feet was chilled. Like the skin of gods that no longer answered prayers, I was born into stillness. A stillness dressed in gold, in scrolls of silk, in names carved so deep into stone that they forgot to leave space for the heart. I was called the daughter of the sun, but no warmth ever reached my bones. From the moment I could stand, I was taught how not to fall, how to bow without lowering my eyes, how to smile with the mouth. Not the soul how to speak with pause and perfume, but never truth. They said I was blessed. They said I was royalty. But no one ever asked if I was happy. I remember watching the servants in the courtyard as a girl no taller than the Nile reeds. They would laugh when no priests were near. One gave the other a fig, stolen from the morning offering. Another braided her sister's hair like vines around a tree. They looked at each other, touched each other. I only watched. Even then, the guards stood beside me like statues. Tariq was one of them, a boy then, my age. He used to run races with me in the garden. We would tumble in the dust and not care if the sun burned our cheeks out until one day the high priest pulled him aside. After that, Tariq bowed and never met my eyes again. They called me princess. I was no one's daughter. My mother had passed when I was 7 summers old. They said it was a sickness of the lungs, but I remember the way she clutched her chest. Whenever she looked at my father, she had hair like river reeds and hands that smelled of cinnamon. She used to tuck me in and whisper stories the priests would not approve of, stories of moon goddesses who wept and queens who chose love over legacy. After she left, Meket raised me. Meket was old, her wrinkles folded like papyrus. Her voice was dry as sand, but warm as baked dates. She never told me what to do. She asked questions like riddles. What does a lotus know the mud it bloomed from? What is more powerful, my child, a crown or the hand that removes it? I didn't always understand, but her presence was the only touch I trusted. My father, the pharaoh, was a mountain in human form. He wore his silence like armor. He never raised his hand to me, but he never held me either. I would watch him from behind the columns as he spoke to generals, viziers, priests. His voice was thunder, his face unreadable. The only time I saw him hesitate was when he looked at my mother's empty chair. Even kings have ghosts. On my 12th birthday, they bathed me in milk and saffron and told me I was now sacred, no longer a girl, no longer allowed to laugh too loud or cry too much. They braided my hair with lapis stones and painted my eyelids like a falcon's wing. The priestess whispered, "You are no longer just yourself. You are Egypt." I wanted to ask, if I am Egypt, why do I feel so alone? But I said nothing, because even questions had rules. Nights were the hardest. The palace was vast and full of shadows. I would walk barefoot to the roof where the stars had no titles, and the wind did not care about bloodlines. There, I could imagine I was not royal, just a girl, looking at the same sky as fishermen, the same moon as lovers, the same silence as the gods. I remember one night I found a scroll left behind in the temple library. It wasn't about war. It wasn't about taxes or lineage. It was a poem. A single line struck me like sunlight through a broken jar. Even the lion longs for gentleness when it sleeps. And I wept, not loudly, not with sound, just tears, hot and ancient, that slid silently down a face trained not to feel. Years passed. I grew in silence, wrapped in ritual, framed by duty, but within me a soft rebellion stirred, a whisper that said, there must be more than being seen. There must be someone who truly sees Dot to be born. A royal is to be raised in a world where love must bow before legacy. But I was beginning to wonder, what if I didn't want to rule a kingdom? What if I just wanted to belong to someone's heart? Theme: power without peace, a heart split between duty and self. There is a sound to grief when it is wrapped in incense and paraded through marble. When kings die, they do not fall. They vanish, behind veils of ritual, behind drums and chants, and the scent of crushed lele. My father was dead. And still, they made me walk upright. The coronation came swiftly, too swiftly, as if the throne had been waiting for something to break. I stood before the gods in linen that scratched like guilt. Gold circled my neck, too heavy for a heart. Already tired. The crown was placed upon me like a verdict, and they cheered. For what? For a child who lost her father and gained a burden carved in obsidian? The high council gathered like hawks. 10 men and 1 woman. They bowed low, but their eyes measured. They called me wise. They called me radiant. They called me pharaoh, but none of them called me human. Every day became a lesson in performance. How to smile during war reports. How to ask for taxes without seeming cruel. How to nod when priests spoke nonsense dressed as prophecy. I gave orders that trembled my voice. But I gave them, and the city obeyed. The temples grew. The markets bloomed. The Nile rose kindly that year. And still, I felt like a ghost in my own story. They began to whisper of marriage. A queen must have a king, they said. A ruler must secure the line. As if I were not already enough, I sent word to distant kingdoms. Gold-tongued diplomats and sculptors painting my face on scrolls sent north, west, east, as though love could be summoned like grain from storage. He arrived in the month of Sekhmet, a suitor, a prince from the western sands. They called him strong, handsome, regal. He walked like he owned the palace, like he had already drawn borders around my heart. At the banquet, he looked at me like a possession, like something expensive and easily breakable. He spoke of war, of horses, of cities he would conquer. He smiled at me with teeth too perfect, as though charm were a blade. When I asked him what he knew of the Nile's songs, he laughed. Rivers do not sing, my queen. They flood or they do not. Later, I watched him feed honeyed dates to a court girl without care, without secrecy. He did not want me. He wanted my crown, and the council approved of him. I retreated to the ruins by the river. A temple long forgotten, half swallowed by reeds, half embraced by time. There I could breathe. There I could be unseen. That night I brought no guards, only a single torch in my thoughts, and he was there. The quiet man, he was crouched near. The broken pillars, tracing faded carvings with his fingertips, like one might trace the face of a sleeping child. He startled when he saw me, but did not bow. He stood slowly, respectfully, not fearfully. I didn't mean to intrude. He said, his voice was dry but warm. Like the wind right before sunrise. He was a scribe, I learned later, a keeper of scrolls in the lower library. His name was not important that night, only his stillness. I asked him why he studied a forgotten temple. He said, even forgotten things carry truth. They just wait longer to be heard. We spoke little. He did not ask who I was. Or perhaps he knew and did not care. He spoke of stars, of how the same constellations crown both slaves and queens. He asked me if I ever saw the hawk constellation during harvest. I said no. I had never looked up for long enough. The next night, I returned. And so did he. Again and again. Each visit, a silence shared, a memory folded, a kindness left gently at my feet. He never touched me, never dared. And yet, I began to crave his presence like cool water in the season of dust. Meket noticed. Of course. She did. She brushed my hair one morning and said softly, "The heart knows where to kneel long before the body does." I asked her if I was foolish. She only smiled and whispered, "Even the gods were foolish once. It's how stars were born." One night, back in the court, a prince, the suitor, grew bold. He grabbed my wrist, tried to pull me close in front of the priests. I did not scream. I simply looked at him, not with fear, but with utter nothingness. And he flinched. I said, "This kingdom will never belong to a man who cannot kneel before its river." He left 3 days later, without ceremony, without farewell. The council was displeased, but I was not made to please men. That night, I returned to the ruined temple. He was there, the scribe, still, waiting. He did not ask what had happened, only offered me a seat beside him and a fig wrapped in lotus leaves. I had never tasted something so sweet. To be a queen is to carry the weight of others' futures. But to be a woman is to hope that someone will choose your heart when no one else dares to look at it. There is a festival held when the Nile begins to rise, when lanterns are sent adrift like prayers made of fire, and music hums through the sand like the whisper of forgotten ancestors. I walked through the crowd that night, not as a queen, but as a girl with her head lowered and her heart open for the first time in many years. Beside me walked the scribe, unarmed, unannounced, unafraid, no guards, no crown, only the scent of sweet wine in the air, and his quiet voice telling me that some stars only appear when no one is watching. We walked along the banks where children danced with ribbons and old men told riddles about crocodiles and widows. For once, I was no one special, and that felt like freedom. He bought me roasted nuts from a vendor. I had never tasted them before. The crunch startled me. The salt burned. But I laughed, a true laugh, not the kind I'd been trained to offer the court. He smiled then, the kind of smile that doesn't ask for anything but gives everything. Later, under a fig tree, he told me about his mother, a weaver, and how she used to speak to fabric, as though it had feelings. He said, she believed even cloth remembers the hands that touched it. I asked him what he thought memory truly was. He said, maybe it's what stays with us when we forget who we're supposed to be. After that night, our rhythm changed. I no longer escaped to the ruined temple. I returned, like a tide, like something rightful. There, among the fallen columns and wildflowers, we created a space that was ours. We spoke often, but not always. Sometimes we sat in silence, our thoughts brushing against each other like wind over water. He never reached for my hand, but when he passed me a scroll, his fingers would linger for just a heartbeat too long, and my breath would catch. One afternoon, he brought pigment. Colors, crushed berries and stone dust, mixed with oil. We painted the temple wall together. Not scenes of war or gods, but small things. A reed boat, a pair of sandals, 2 cups facing one another. And finally, 2 hands, open-palmed, side by side. That night, I asked him why he never bowed to me. He said, because reverence is not always on the knees. Sometimes it's in the way one listens. The emotional flood came slowly, like the Nile itself. I began to sleep again, real sleep, not the guarded stillness I had known for years. I wrote poetry in the corners of scrolls. A line would come, to me like a whisper. He touched nothing, but still made everything feel softer. Meket watched from the edge, as she always did. She brought me warm honeyed milk one evening and asked nothing. But before leaving, she murmured, the heart you're feeding will someday feed you back. One morning during council, I found myself distracted. A single thought repeating like a chant. He sees me. Not my robe, not my power, Me. The girl behind the crown, the voice behind the silence. The human in the history. I did not know what to call this feeling. Love, perhaps? But it felt more like recognition. As if we had always known each other in some other life, beneath some other stars. Then came a moment I will never forget. He arrived at the palace gates, not as a lover, not as a threat, but as a scholar. Had discovered something in the ruins. A scroll, buried in sand, preserved in oil and linen. It told of a law. An ancient decree written by a queen long forgotten. A woman who ruled not by her father's name, but by her own. The law said a pharaoh may choose their consort by soul, not by blood, during the festival of open waters. I held the scroll in my hands like it was fire, because in that moment I understood something rare. My story was not over. It was just beginning. That night I went to the temple alone. I found him sitting where we had painted. He looked up, calm, always calm. I sat beside him. And for the first time, I reached for his hand. No words, only warmth. And in that stillness, we both knew. To love quietly is not to love less. It is to plant a seed in the shadows and let it bloom in its own time. Beneath the palace, there are rooms the sun has never touched. Vaults carved long before I was born by men who feared memory more than death. Here, in the stone's cold breath, truth waits. And on that day, so did I. It began with footsteps too loud. Guards running, eyes shifting like the wind before a storm. Meket found me in the inner courtyard. She did not speak. She only pressed a scrap of papyrus into my palm. On it, one word: return. The first suitor had returned. Not with gifts, with soldiers. He entered through the western gate, declaring himself protector of the throne, and claiming I had betrayed Egypt by consorting with a man of no blood. No title, no right. He held the scribe in chains. They brought him to the council chambers, dust on his face, hands bound, but eyes unbroken. He did not look at me. Not out of shame, but protection, as if looking would make it harder for me too. Do what I must? The suitor stood tall, mock pity in his voice. He called the scribe a threat, said love had made me weak. Said I was no longer fit to rule. The council murmured. Some eyes narrowed, others trembled. I said nothing. Instead, I walked to the sacred archives beneath the throne. I lit every torch myself, walked past my father's old seals, past the bones of old kings whose names time no longer recalls. And there it was, the scroll. The ancient law the scribe had unearthed. It had been written in my mother's hand. The woman they had tried to erase had crafted it with blood and wisdom. A decree allowing the pharaoh to choose a soul over a crown, not out of indulgence, but to protect the kingdom from loveless rulers. I returned to the chamber, holding not a sword, but a memory. I stepped onto the dais and spoke, not as a girl, not even as a queen, but as a woman who had lived silence and now chose to break it. I have been told love is a weakness, I said. Then let it be, because weakness does not bind hands without reason. Weakness does not chain hearts out of fear. I unrolled the scroll. This law was buried, just as you buried her name. But stone remembers. And so do I. I walked down the steps. My sandals made no sound. I stood before the scribe. I touched the iron chains. And with the seal of my signet, I broke them. The guards looked to the council, but the council looked to me. The suitor shouted, but his voice was no longer thunder. It was wind, empty and desperate. I turned to the people, those gathered in the halls, the guards, the scribes, the cooks, the children hiding behind pillars. I said, let it be known. One choose not a man of kingdoms, but a man of kindness. Not for bloodline, but for soul. He looked at me then, The scribe, he said nothing, just stepped forward, and knelt, not out of obedience, but gratitude, and slowly I knelt too, before him. Before the gods, before the truth. They say silence fell in that chamber, so thick you could taste it, until Mekhet whispered, as if speaking to the air itself, "At last, Egypt remembers." In the years that followed, we ruled together, quietly, gently, no great. Wars, no towering obelisks in our names, only scrolls written with soft hands. Gardens blooming in the palace's heart. Children taught that love is not a threat to power, but its beginning. Sometimes, I still return to the ruined temple. The painting remains, faded, but not gone. The two hands, still side by side, and when the wind moves through the reeds, I hear my mother's voice. Even pharaohs are just hearts wrapped in gold and dust.